9/11/2001 is a day that most of us will remember for the rest of our lives. If you're like me, you can recall exactly where you were when you heard the news, just as you probably have vivid memories of the chaotic mix of emotions, bewilderment, sadness, anger, fear, that we all felt as we spent the morning hours glued to a TV, unsure of what was happening and what might happen next. I remember this day 20 years ago like it was yesterday. As a co-founder of JetBlue Airways and the leader of the company's emergency command center, I was welcoming a group of new hires on their first day of training, telling them how thankful I was that they were joining our new airline. A member of my staff burst into the room, telling me that a commercial aircraft, possibly one of ours, had just flown into the World Trade Center. Looking out the windows in the back of my classroom, I could actually see the black smoke rising from the Trade Center's North Tower, about 7 miles west of our headquarters building. I remember running from the training room to our command center and meeting other JetBlue leaders along the way. We gathered around a collection of TVs that we had installed to help us deal with the crisis should we ever find ourselves in the middle of one. And as we waited news about the plane that struck the tower, could it have been one of ours? We shared opinions on what could possibly cause a large plane, on a day as clear as it was that day, to fly into a skyscraper in New York City. Well, as you know, it didn't take long for a second plane to hit the South Tower. At that moment, as a former military leader, I knew we were at war. Thinking back on these events every year, which I do as part of my annual 9/11 birthday celebration, wouldn't you know, I also remember that somehow I knew the lasting impact the tragic series of events that day would have not only on the airline industry, but on companies everywhere. I knew that relationships between airlines and their customers, airlines and their employees, airlines and their regulatory and governmental counterparts, airlines and the communities they served, airlines and the media, and even airlines and their competitors would never be the same. And the relationship between every business and all of its stakeholders would, from that point forward, feel a bit more fragile, a bit less permanent, and worthy of more than just cursory consideration. While people around the world watched the news, unsure of what to do or how to help, JetBlue leaders were faced with our first major crisis. As you would expect, we had plans and procedures for single aircraft emergencies and other rare but potentially dangerous situations, but we had never imagined something like this. But we had always known that when we faced a crisis, we would do whatever we could to serve all of our stakeholders to the best of our abilities. Throughout that tragic day, JetBlue leaders not only lived up to the commitment expressed in the airline's vision statement of bringing humanity back to air travel, we saw firsthand that in times of crisis, there are many, both inside and outside of the organization, who depend on us for support during uncertain, frightening, and tragic times. This 20-year anniversary of 9/11 reminds us of how important these lessons truly are, and in the wake of a global pandemic and a series of ongoing threats to basic human rights, how rare they are in practice. Reflecting on this national tragedy, what should we remember about leadership? Well, in my view, we should be reminded of our obligations as leaders to serve all of our stakeholders, employees, customers, suppliers, investors, communities, and others, particularly in these critical times. Recalling the events of 9/11 should remind us that during a crisis, all organizational stakeholders are threatened and deserve as much attention and support as we can provide. As a business leader with experience in dealing with significant disruptions, and as a scholar with a research focus on crisis leadership, I know that many leaders find it difficult to serve their stakeholders effectively during turbulent times. One primary reason is that during a crisis, leaders will and must focus first on what they can clearly see, which is how the situation is threatening their organization's ability to operate, to function, to survive. This is a rational and an appropriate first step. From there, however, leaders must learn how to expand their perspective and serve the needs of the many other stakeholders who are being or have been impacted by these same threats. 20 years ago today, JetBlue leaders learned the importance of doing just that. And if you'll bear with me for one more minute, I'll share a short example of one of the most rewarding experiences I've had during my professional career. At 9:25 a.m. Eastern Time on 9/11, the Federal Aviation Administration closed the U.S. National Airspace System and ordered the over 4,300 planes in the air at the time to land as soon as possible. Several of these aircraft belonged to JetBlue. Without the option to continue to airports served by our company, these planes were required to land at unfamiliar locations. Given the epicenter of the crisis in the New York area, where JetBlue was headquartered, it would have certainly been understandable for JetBlue leaders to assume that the crews and customers on these aircraft could care for themselves, for the day at least, wherever they safely landed. Instead, we felt it core to our vision and values that we do more to support the individuals, the people, on these flights. We contacted the FAA and determined where each of our diverting flights was going to land. We were then able to reach out to hotels and bus services at each of these locations to secure accommodations and transportation from these airports for all customers and crew, even before any of them had landed. As our planes were arriving at their unplanned destinations, we knew that our crews would be busy for hours taking care of our customers, helping them deal with the unprecedented circumstances. So, leaders of our pilot and flight attendant groups reached out to the families of our crew members to provide contact information for the hotels we had reserved for them. At the same time, our reservation crew members called the emergency contacts that had been shared in our customers' ticket records with this same information. We did these things not only because they were the right things to do, but because we understood the importance of caring for all of our stakeholders. During a crisis, as we have all seen far too frequently over these past 20 years, it's not just the interest of some stakeholders that are threatened. More often than not, as was the case during 9/11, a crisis threatens the interests of all of them. As you think back on the tragic events of 9/11, remember that being a leader carries a great deal of responsibility and requires a commitment to many different people, some of whom won't easily come to mind. As JetBlue leaders learned on 9/11, caring for all stakeholders during a crisis isn't just good business, it reveals the true character of an organization.